Tiny particles are flooding Southeast Asia, poisoning our land, air, and sea.
I would not be surprised if many of the technologies that we have fail to capture the microplastics.
Invisible to the human eye, tiny pieces of microplastics have infiltrated our food chains and our bodies.
Kalau misalnya mikroplastik tadi diserap oleh ikan, kemudian dimakan oleh manusia, maka berarti akan menumpuk di manusia, dan itu berbahaya.
Where do these minute particles come from?
Tidak ada metode cara untuk membersihkan itu.
And what dangers do these minuscule pieces of plastic really pose?
We're raising a generation of essentially plastic people.
Ikan bandeng adalah ikan yang banyak dikonsumsi di masyarakat Indonesia, baik untuk dimakan langsung atau digoreng ataupun dibikin awetan.
At the University of Indonesia, Professor Mufti Pathalapatria and his students at the Department of Biology are studying the innards of this fish, searching for something that shouldn't be there. Under a microscope, and what we're looking for comes to light. Microplastics.
Ya, mungkin kalau lihat dari gambar ini mungkin ada beberapa mikroplastik yang bisa kita tentukan ya, misalnya seperti yang ini, kemudian juga ada yang bentuknya seperti fragmen, kemudian ada beberapa yang film gitu. Jadi ada beberapa kandidat mikroplastik yang bisa kita hitung di sini.
Microplastic are small plastic particles measuring 5 millimeters in length or less. They're formed from the breakdown of larger pieces of plastic, such as bottles and containers. Microplastics have permeated all parts of our ecosystem: land, sea, and air. And Southeast Asia has it the worst. A 2024 study by Cornell University found that among 109 countries, Filipinos and Vietnamese eat some of the most microplastics, about 11 grams per month. Malaysians came in second, ingesting 12 grams per month. And at the top are Indonesians. They consumed the most microplastics, about 15 grams every month. That's the equivalent of eating 3 credit cards.
Many countries in Southeast Asia have become very dependent on food that is wrapped in plastics. And when we wrap things in plastic, there are instances that the bigger plastics may be scratched, thus producing a lot of these microplastics, which then mix into the foods and the drinks that we are drinking, which when we consume the food, it goes with the microplastics in it.
The fish in Professor Mufti's lab were fished out from the Jakarta Bay, an area north of the city. The bay supplies fish and seafood to the many markets of the capital, feeding millions in the city. In one study, microplastics were found in the digestive tracts of 3/4 of the fish samples from Jakarta Bay.
Ini hanya satu bagian dari ada 13 sistem sungai yang mengalir menuju ke Teluk Jakarta. Dan itu akan terbawa ke Teluk Jakarta. Kita bisa lihat di sini semua sampah yang dari perkotaan, dari pemukiman. Begitu bentuknya teluk, maka si sampah ini dia hanya akan tertransportasi itu ngikutin bentuk teluknya. Jadi tidak langsung keluar.
About 70% of the plastic waste from the ocean comes from the land. The United Nations estimates that Indonesia produces 3.2 million tons of unmanaged plastic waste annually. Over a third of that waste ends up in the ocean.
Kita bisa lihat ini kan bekas-bekas saset seperti susu kental manis yang kecil. Ini ada juga bekas pengharum untuk cucian ya. Ini juga ada yang bekas makanan, terus ini seperti gelas plastik minuman. Jadi ini adalah jelas bahwa semua bahan ini terbuat dari plastik. Ini secara umum beberapa adalah bahannya polyethylene. Kemudian yang selebihnya ini densitasnya lebih tinggi daripada polyethylene, namanya PET.
PET, or polyethylene terephthalate, is a type of plastic used to make a wide range of daily products, from plastic sachets to bottled drinks. However, PET changes when exposed to the elements.
Jadi kalau misalnya ini dia sangat banyak, kemudian dia akan berdiam lama di Teluk Jakarta, kemudian dia akan terdegradasi, satu oleh sinar matahari, dia mempunyai cahaya ultraviolet, ya, kemudian oleh gelombang arus gitu ya, dan juga oleh pH air. Jadi dia berproses secara fisika maupun secara kimia di laut. Contohnya seperti plastik yang sebesar ini, dia akan mengalami degradasi menjadi lebih kecil, namanya mikroplastik. Tetapi dalam jangka waktu yang lama, dia akan terdegradasi lagi menjadi lebih kecil lagi, namanya nanoplastik.
Nanoplastics are significantly smaller than microplastic. They can be in the range of 1 to 1,000 nanometers. A nanometer is 1/1,000,000th of a millimeter. So nanoplastic particles are as small as strands of DNA or the SARS-CoV-2 virus. The small size of micro and nanoplastics makes them particularly troublesome.
Nah, kalau misalnya partikel yang besar mungkin akan mudah gitu. Kita bisa dengan jaring yang agak besar kita bersihkan. Tapi ini sudah tidak terlihat oleh mata gitu. Jadi untuk yang mikroplastik ini saja itu untuk penanggulangannya itu cukup sulit tuh. Karena ya kalau secara laboratorium itu teman-teman di teknik kimia udah bisa, kita bisa mencari kok sampai 90%, 80% mikroplastik. Tapi itu tentunya dengan alat atau dengan peralatan yang cukup mahal gitu ya. Sehingga untuk skala besar, misalnya laut mau disaring, kemudian air sungai mau disaring, itu tentunya nggak ekonomis itu, atau belum ekonomis.
At wastewater treatment plants, filtering out micro and nanoplastics is challenging because of their size.
The filter has to be very fine, no? As in 0.1 microns dapat yung fineness nung filter para ma-filter out niya yung microplastics.
Tapi yang tantangannya adalah kemudian nanoplastik. Apakah ada filter yang sudah seukuran bisa memfilter nanoplastik? Saya rasa ini belum ada. Gitu. Jadi tetap aja bahwa belum efisien, belum efektif dan efisien.
Reverse osmosis is one method of removing small pieces of plastics, using a semi-permeable membrane to separate contaminants. Doing this can remove 99 to 100% of microplastics. But reverse osmosis is expensive, and it's also energy intensive.
Right now, there is no regulatory mechanism to obligate companies and water treatment plants to include microplastics as one of those that they need to remove and monitor. Until now, we don't know how efficient the water treatment plants are, primarily because there's no policy that they need to comply with. Microplastics monitoring is still not part of the water quality standards being monitored by our government agencies, which would mean that there is no periodic monitoring of the occurrence of microplastics in the treated water from these treatment plants.
If they're not removed, microplastics fill our waterways, and in some cases end up in the food we eat, like the fish on Dr. Mufti's lab table.
Because when microplastics end up in the environment, they're also being coated by microorganisms such as bacteria. And bacteria are naturally occurring food. So microplastics that are coated by bacteria are then mistaken by food by fish. So when they feed on this, they think that they're actually feeding on naturally occurring food, when in fact, these are microplastics coated by their own food.
A 2024 study found microplastics in 16 commonly eaten protein sources. The study also found that highly processed foods contained more microplastics than less processed foods.
Ini terutama ikan-ikan yang ukurannya kecil ya, ikan seperti ikan teri gitu ya. Tapi kita misalnya langsung digoreng, langsung dibikin makanan gitu ya. Sehingga yang kita makan itu adalah seluruh tubuh ikan tersebut. Nah berarti semua mikroplastik yang ada di ikan tersebut, terutama di insang dan di pencernaan, itu yang paling banyak ya ditemukan, itu akan termakan juga oleh manusia gitu ya. Makanya saya mengusulkan atau menganjurkan lah, makanlah ikan-ikan yang besar gitu. Karena ikan yang besar itu biasanya atau umumnya kita nggak makan semuanya kan. Tapi saya juga tidak menjamin nanoplastiknya gitu. Karena nanoplastik itu tadi bisa tembus ke peredaran darah gitu. Dia bisa masuk peredaran darah, bisa mungkin tersangkut di bagian daging, di bagian apa gitu yang kita makan.
And we not only ingest microplastics in our food, we also breathe them in. East and Southeast Asians can inhale up to 2.8 million particles a day.
I think if you look at the trends on the studies of microplastics in the Philippines, it's still in its infancy. We are at that stage when we are just trying to detect, to count them, to classify them. But how many microplastics the seafoods have that we consume from the market, we don't have that system and national intervention yet.
Scientists have known about the ubiquity of microplastics for some time. What's less certain is what harm there is in ingesting these minute pieces of plastic. But increasingly, we're beginning to understand the impact on our health. How worried should we be?
Mamasura po ako nangongolekta po ako ng mga basura sa mga bahay-bahay. Mas pinipilian po namin, kinukuha namin ng mga kalakal na pwede mabenta sa junk shop. Ano po yung mga plastic, lata, bote ng soft drinks, mga bote ng mga ketchup, mga laruan na mga sira, ganyan.
Since 2006, 35-year-old Clarissa de la Cruz Bacungan has been living and working in Happyland. Happyland is one of the Philippines' poorest slums. The name Happyland is said to come from the Bisaya word hapilan, which means garbage dump. And this is where Metro Manila's trash ends up. There aren't exact figures of how much waste Happyland receives, but the Metro Manila area produces 8,600 tons of waste a day. People like Clarissa scavenge the plastics to sell to recyclers.
5 kilo ka rin sa kalakal. Yung nga lang, halo-halo pa yun, hindi pa hiwa-hiwalay. Minsan kikita ka 200 mahigit. Lalo kasi ngayon mababa kalakal, kaya mababa rin ang kita mo.
Happyland officially has a population of 12,000, but other estimates put that figure between 20 to 40,000. They may not be aware of the risks that they're exposed to.
Ate, alam niyo po ba kung ano yung microplastic? Hindi po. Pero alam niyo po kung ano yung health risk ng mga plastic, pag naaamoy po natin, pag napapasama sa pagkain.
May nakukuha lang na sakit. Ganun lang. Nyari katulad ng ubo, hinihikay yung bata. Yun lang.
Ano po yung ate? Alam pong pagkakaalam niyo kung ano yung microplastic?
Naririnig ko siya, pero pagkakaintindi ko plastic siya. Di ba yung mga gamit na mga Tupperware, kunyari, parang ganon. Pero hindi ko alam kung ano ba talaga yung microplastic. Naririnig ko lang yun.
So what happens when we ingest or inhale microplastics?
These are alien substances in our bodies, and they're so small that some of them, these nanoplastics, can actually go past the blood-brain barrier and enter our brains, enter vital organs.
A 2022 study in the Netherlands found that almost 80% of the people tested had microplastics in their blood. Once in our bloodstream, microplastics can travel to various parts of our bodies. our bodies can deal with them in some capacity.
Dun sa mga napunta sa bloodstream, yung mga smaller ones, this can be filtered out by the kidney. So yung body natin, the liver and the kidney can flush out these microplastics but in a limited capacity. Daw, yung mga natitira sa loob ng body natin, okay, our body has what we call this immune system defense. So may mga cells that are involved in the immune system, so they eat this microplastics. But some of the microplastics are kumbaga stays inside, and yun yung nagpo-cause ng mga damage. Pero right now, limited pa rin yung mga studies on actually how our body responds to these microplastics.
Increasingly, scientists are beginning to understand the health risks associated with these minuscule particles of plastic as they show up in our organs. The blood-brain barrier is a semi-permeable barrier that separates the central nervous system from the circulatory system. This barrier allows the entry of essential nutrients and oxygen while blocking harmful substances. Yet a study published in 2025 found that microplastics can pass through this barrier. In fact, the amount of microplastics found has increased by approximately 50% over the past 8 years, a rate which mirrors the increasing amount of plastic waste we generate.
Untuk mereka yang ditemukan mikroplastik di darahnya, ya, itu ternyata punya hubungan dengan terjadinya gangguan kognitif. Jadi misalnya paparan yang tinggi itu punya kerentanan mengalami gangguan kognitif itu sekitar 36,25 kali. Itu lebih rentan dibandingkan yang paparannya rendah. Dibandingkan yang sedikit terpajan atau pola konsumsi mikroplastiknya rendah.
A 2023 study using mice found that after a 3-week exposure to microplastics, the mice started to exhibit behaviors akin to dementia in humans. There was a decrease in a protein that supports many cell processes of the brain. The decrease in this specific protein has been linked to neurodegenerative diseases like dementia. Other organs are also susceptible.
Jantung ya sama sebenarnya, kurang lebih karena jantung itu kan pusatnya darah ya, artinya dia yang memompa semua darah pasti lewat jantung juga pada akhirnya. Maka tentu asumsinya ya menjadi banyak di situ. Mikroplastik di situ akan banyak juga gitu.
In a 2024 study, researchers examined fatty plaques removed from the blood vessels of patients with arterial disease. They found that more than half had deposits contaminated with microplastics. Those whose plaque contained plastics were almost 5 times more likely to suffer from a stroke or heart attack compared to those whose plaque was free of microplastics.
Di beberapa studi termasuk di hewan coba segala macam itu memang memperlihatkan ada proses-proses peradangan ya atau inflamasi yang kita kenal ketika dia terjadi agregasi atau pengelompokan ya, maka punya potensi menyumbat juga atau setidaknya membuat aliran darahnya menjadi tidak lancar ya pada suatu waktu lah gitu ya.
Microplastics can even affect our next generation. In 2024, University of New Mexico Health Sciences researchers found microplastics in all 62 samples of placenta that it tested.
Yung sa so sa nanay, yung maternal bloodstream connected siya do sa placenta at saka sa baby. Kumbaga yung placenta kasi yung nagko-connect do sa mother at saka sa baby. So while the placenta kasi meron siyang barrier protective barrier. Not all substances can be filtered out kasi ng placenta, and very small particles can pass through the placental barrier. Kaya pati yung baby pwedeng at risk na maapektuhan nitong plastics na to.
You have to think about that we're raising a generation that has been exposed to plastics even before they're born. We're raising a generation of essentially plastic people that have plastics in their bodies that are exposed constantly to plastics.
Not far off from where Clarissa was collecting plastic is her home. This small shack is where she lives with her husband and their 5 children, the youngest of which is just 2 years old. As a mother, she worries about her children being surrounded by so much waste.
Sa mga balita rin po, kasi nakikita namin yung sa TV na pinapakita na delikado yung mga plastic na paglalaruan o na hahaluan sa pagkain ng mga bata. Nag-aalala rin kasi hindi natin masabi yung minsan madisgrasya, makakadunok ng ano. Hindi na mahirap yung ganun eh. Mau-hospital ka talaga sa ganun pag nakaano ka ng mga nakakalasong bagay. Dito lang naman po kasi kami nabuhay. Ito lang po yung hanap buhay na pwede namin pasukin. Dito rin kami kumukuha ng pang-araw-araw na gastos, pambaon, para sa nag-aaral, gutom. Walang makakain kami. Kasi yan lang ang trabaho namin na talagang tatagal ka.
Yung mga bata, no? Mga possible na mga adverse effect ng exposure to microplastics can be developmental toxicity. Yung mga studies na sinasabi, di ba, pwedeng magkaroon ng mag-leach out yung mga chemicals. Tapos magkakaroon siya ng it can disrupt yung developmental process ng mga bata.
Some of the chemicals in plastics include phthalates, bisphenols, and polyfluoroalkyl. These are so-called forever chemicals because they don't break down easily in the environment.
So when you're looking at all of the types of plastics in the world, around 16,000 chemicals are being used in different kinds of plastics. And over 4,000 of these chemicals are actually considered hazardous to humans. There's no regulation preventing manufacturers of plastic, makers of plastic, from using these chemical additives. With all of these chemicals that are being used in plastics, there is that concern that these will eventually leach out.
Yang ada kolaborasi saya di Malaysia gitu ya, Universitas Terengganu, dia melakukan penelitian dengan koleganya di Amerika, itu sel kanker di kolon manusia, di usus besar ya, yang sebelum keluar dari anus itu diambil, diperiksa gitu. Dan ternyata di situ banyak mikroplastiknya. Artinya mikroplastik ini tuh bisa memicu pertumbuhan sel-sel kanker itu.
Yet even as our understanding of plastic risk grows, so does the manufacture of the artificial material. Every year brings a new peak to plastic production. About 460 million metric tons were produced in 2024. Without proper disposal, the plastic waste continues to pile up in Happy Land, leaching into the ground and waterways. For Clarissa, she hopes for a better future for her children.
Makapagtapos po sila ng pag-aaral nila para hindi naman po sila lumaki na dito talaga. Yung pag maayos na gumanda ng buhay nila, lalayo sila rito. Ayoko po yung anak ko na magiging kagaya ko, na namamasura lang. Ang gusto ko sa kanila, makapagtrabaho ng maayos.
But why did microplastics become such a big problem in Southeast Asia? Across Southeast Asia, many sundries and condiments are sold in these little packets, known as sachets.
Saya juga menggunakan produk yang menggunakan sachet gitu, seperti kopi, seperti sampo, seperti sabun gitu. Kalau untuk sehari-hari berapa sachet yang saya habiskan mungkin nggak terhitung jumlahnya ya, mungkin bisa 10 atau 20 karena saya pengkonsumsi kopi.
Jujur aku nggak terlalu bisa hidup tanpa sasetan karena menurut aku sasetan itu lebih praktis dibandingin harus kayak bawa-bawa satu botol gede kayak gitu sih menurut aku.
By breaking up foodstuff and liquids into small single-use amounts, they become more affordable especially for the lower income. The Philippines goes through 164 million single-use sachets each day. They make up more than half the country's plastic footprint.
The reality is that Filipinos don't have a choice. Right now, the only option for them to receive their daily necessities, whether that's food products or household care or personal care products, is that they're packaged in single-use plastic packaging. Now, if companies were to provide these goods or products in reuse and refill systems, then Filipinos now have options to opt away from plastic-free products.
Di Asia Tenggara itu masih regulasi terkait pembatasan penggunaan plastik sekali pakai itu masih belum tegas gitu ya. Dan di Indonesia sendiri itu masih minim 78% masyarakat di Indonesia itu lebih suka menggunakan plastik sekali pakai. Karena apa? Karena memang yang pertama harganya murah, kemudian yang kedua itu fleksibel, bisa dibawa kemana-mana.
According to a Greenpeace report, worldwide, as many as 855 billion sachets were sold in 2020. 50% of that was in Southeast Asia.
Kalau ini lapisan luar ya, ini kalau kita buka, ini ada lapisan filmnya. Nah, lapisan filmnya ini juga mengandung kayak lapisan aluminium. Nah, ini yang membuat susah untuk terurai. Kalaupun terurai mungkin bisa puluhan ratusan tahun. Jadi ini yang bikin pencemaran sebetulnya. Kebanyakan tidak bisa di-recycle, tidak bisa didaur ulang. Gitu. Ya karena memang bahannya yang memang susah untuk didaur ulang. Gitu. Dan sekali pakai ini, sekali pakai.
Southeast Asia has a plastic problem. Per capita, Singapore is the top consumer of single-use plastics. Of the 10 highest plastic polluting countries, 6 are in Southeast Asia.
Jadi gini Mas, sehari-hari buang sampah terutama warga, pas waktu sepi itu dilempar aja ke kali Mas. Jadi kayaknya adat buang sampah itu udah tradisi dari dulu.
54-year-old Eddie lives in the neighborhood of Manggarai in South Jakarta. His house, which is typical of many in the city, is in front of one of the myriad of small rivers that run through Indonesia's capital. The river is also the community's dumping ground.
Kalau orang-orang sini itu Mas, yang saya tahu, buang sampahnya kayaknya lebih gampang ke kali. Lah kalau saya sendiri ya gimana sih, masa saya lihat orang-orang itu buang sampahnya jauh-jauh. Ya paling nggak ikut-ikutan lah.
The culture around waste explains why so much plastic is found in the waters around Southeast Asia. According to a 2018 government survey, 7 in 10 Indonesians say that they do not care about waste management.
Ya, tentunya masalah utama adalah kesadaran dari warga masyarakat gitu ya untuk tidak membuang sampah ke badan air. Ini sebenarnya kita sudah sering melakukan edukasi, sosialisasi ke warga masyarakat untuk tidak membuang sampah ke sungai-sungai, ke kali gitu. Kira-kira seperti itu.
I think you'll see that the problem goes beyond individual behaviors or practices. Yes, there are still challenges in getting people to dispose of their plastic waste properly, but at the same time there are gaps and sometimes completely lacking waste management systems in communities. Sometimes there are no bins, there are no material recovery facilities in our barangays or villages, so they have no choice, or there really is no way for them to properly dispose of different kinds of waste.
Since the late 20th century, Southeast Asia experienced rapid urbanization. In some cases, waste management infrastructure hasn't kept up with urban expansion.
Truk sampah itu datangnya belum tentu sehari 2 hari, Mas. Kadang bisa datang 3 hari, kadang bisa 5 hari. Mungkin kendalanya dari sana. Jadi yang jelas kita kalau nunggu truk sampah, itu sampah yang ada dalam rumah tuh ngumpul banyak. Lebih baiknya tinggal dilempar aja.
Kalau lokasi-lokasi yang memang cukup sulit untuk akses kendaraan alat angkut kami masuk ke area pemukiman warga, nah itu warganya masih membuang sampah atau menempatkan sampah di pinggir-pinggir jalan. Kami gitu ya, tentunya sudah berkolaborasi dengan para lurah untuk mengedukasi, mensosialisasi lagi warganya untuk tidak membuang sampah.
At the Kali Adam River in Jakarta, city workers are scooping out trash. Working for 8 hours a day, they collect an average of 15 tons of waste a day. Yet an estimated 21 tons of garbage still makes its way into Jakarta Bay. A 2022 analysis of 68 rivers in Indonesia found that virtually all were contaminated with microplastics.
Jadi di beberapa titik aliran itu kita pasang sekatan sampah dari hulu, di pertengahan dan di hilirnya. Nah, sampah-sampah yang ada di kali tersebut nanti akan kami angkut, setelah sampai sekatan akan kami kumpulkan dan kami akan angkut. Kami di DLH saat ini sudah memiliki 29 saringan sampah sungai. Memang jumlahnya menurut kajian kami ini masih kurang.
Even if the waste is collected, how it's dumped could still leach microplastics back into the environment. This is the Bantar Gebang landfill. Plastic waste collected from waterways are sent here. Located an hour outside of Jakarta, it's the largest landfill in Southeast Asia, covering an area of about 200 football fields. Landfills and open dump sites are the most commonly used methods of waste disposal in Southeast Asia, absorbing 55% of the region's solid waste.
Penumpukan sampah plastik di TPA gitu ya, itu sangat berbahaya. Kenapa gitu? Karena lambat laun plastik ini akan hancur juga gitu, akan hancur. Tapi bukannya larut, ya, bukannya terurai, tapi tercerai-berai menjadi partikel yang lebih kecil dan mengalir meresap ke tanah, gitu ya, atau dia mengalir ke selokan, ke kanal, ke sungai, kemudian ke laut, atau dia juga bisa masuk ke dalam air tanah itu. Jadi setelah masuk ke dalam tanah, hujannya cukup deras, gitu ya, sehingga dia akan ikut air sampai ke reservoir air itu.
The issue is that 65% of the landfills in the Philippines are illegal, meaning they are substandard. Sometimes some of them are open landfills. And because they do not follow the regulated designs as well as the standard designs for a landfill, many of these become also a hotspot or a source of plastics that end up in the environment.
Bantar Gebang holds an estimated 45 million tons of waste and is expected to reach capacity in 2025.
Our government in the waste management still using old paradigms. It means the actions to dealing with the waste problem is just collect and then transporting and then dumping. That's why we dealing with the waste emergency in more than 300 cities that has dump site with the over capacity and overload.
Secara ideal kan pengelolaan sampah itu harusnya di hulunya yang harus kita fokuskan kan. Sekarang kan di kita masih terbalik tuh piramidanya. Yang dominan kan yang di hilirnya. Dan itu pun juga masih open dumping yang dilakukan. Jadi memang kita punya kebijakan untuk mendorong upaya ini terintegrasi dari hulu sampai ke hilir.
Upstream would mean reducing the use of plastics, something that Indonesia is working on. The country plans to phase out single-use plastic by the end of 2029.
Mungkin sudah di angka 130-an pemerintah daerah yang menerapkan kebijakan pembatasan plastik sekali pakai. Kemudian yang kedua, teman-teman bisa lihat bagaimana lifestyle masyarakat juga yang sudah berubah. Jadi kalau misalnya teman-teman datang ke supermarket di Jakarta, ini semua sudah bawa kantong belanja. Bahkan yang jualan tumbler juga ada di plaza-plaza yang kelas atas di Indonesia. Artinya lifestyle-nya orang-orang di Indonesia sekarang.
In 2020, Jakarta issued a ban on single-use plastic bags in malls and markets. A year later, there was a 42% reduction in plastic bag use at the household level. Other countries have similar plans to ban single plastic use. Yet, as efforts to ban single-use plastics are ongoing, Southeast Asia still imports plastic waste. Developed countries have sent their refuse to Southeast Asia. Southeast Asian governments say the import is needed to support the recycling industries. However, not all imported plastic ends up being recycled.
Recycling industries, actually they're not using 100% of the imported waste to the industrial processes, but they're dumping the imported waste because it's residual and they're dumping everywhere in the dump site illegally near the river side, and it's contributing directly to microplastic pollution.
Countries like the Philippines, Malaysia and Vietnam continue to import plastic waste. But Thailand and Indonesia plan to ban imports by 2025.
Jadi sejak 1 Januari 2025 udah nggak ada lagi rekomendasi yang dikeluarkan oleh KLH, dan itu otomatis menyebabkan importasi scrap plastik tidak bisa dilakukan.
Instead, Indonesia plans to rely on domestic supply for recycling.
Dengan komitmen kita mendorong masyarakat memilah sampah, gerakan-gerakan masyarakat, kemudian social ecopreneur, pemilahan sampah dan sebagainya, itu bisa kita selesaikan untuk importasi scrap plastik tersebut.
Meanwhile, tons of plastic waste continue to be discarded in the waterways and dumping grounds across Southeast Asia each day.
One thing that we realized when we're studying plastics, for the past decade is that there's no one solution that fits all. You need to understand the psyche, the mindset, the behavior, the cultural aspect, because plastic at the end of the day is a socio-economic issue. The reason why people consume plastic is because they need food, and the food that they are able to afford are those that are stored in smaller packages. So if we cannot address the problem on the socio-economic part, it would be very difficult to address the problem on the environmental side.
Is there a way out of this plastic puzzle?
Good morning po, naka 658 kilo po kayo. Ang points niyo po is 1,127. Pairam ko na lang po yung card niyo.
In Quezon City in the Philippines, plastic can be turned into points, which can be exchanged for food and other essentials.
8 plus yung last, ma'am. Ma'am, magkano itong kilo? Magkano ito? 5 kilo? 0. Magkano ito? Total, ma'am.
And this is part of the city's trash to cashback program.
Hindi lang po si Quezon City, but the entire Philippines po ay talagang globally, tayo po ay napakataas yung volume po ng single-use plastic na na-generate. Kaya ang trash to cashback ay isa po sa mga programa ng city para po ma-reduce po natin yung volume of waste ng mga single-use plastic po natin. Sana nga po itong mga tao ay matuto sila na i-segregate itong mga single-use plastic para hindi na po makarating sa landfill.
Once a month, collection points are set up in various areas to make it easy for residents to exchange their plastics. The program hopes to spark behavioral change.
Proper information and education, communication campaign, napaka-importante po yun. I-educate po natin yung mga tao na yung ang solusyon kasi para sa akin, ha?
Ito po, zero. 6 na pansit canton, 4 na tuna, 5-5.
Since its launch in 2021, the program has collected over 300,000 kilograms of plastic. 4 other cities in the Philippines are adopting similar schemes. In Indonesia, similar waste banks are also being rolled out.
Jadi masyarakat yang milah sampah, sehingga inilah yang berhubungan dengan industri atau mitra daur ulang nantinya. Ini yang kita harapkan terjadi di 75.000 desa di seluruh Indonesia. Kita yang menyiapkan standar operasional prosedurnya, guideline-nya kita yang siapkan. Nanti teman-teman di Kementerian Desa dan desa yang akan eksekusinya. Kita sudah lakukan itu di 8 desa yang kita kerjasamakan. Itu mereka sudah jalan ya. Jadi ada bank sampah induk di desanya. Ini kita harapkan bisa akselerasinya cepat. Begitu kita punya guideline-nya, sehingga 75.000 desa itu bisa pakai.
Once the plastic is collected, it's picked up by a recycler for recycling. But there are limits to this process.
Recycling actually is not an infinite process. So a piece of plastic can only be recycled 2 to 3 times because of the way it's made up. And it's the same for paper. For plastics, it's made up of chains of polymers. Basically, as they get recycled, those polymer chains that make up plastics get shorter and shorter. So after 3 times, for example, they're so degraded that they're no longer fit for recycling. And it gets thrown away and ends up in landfill because it's no longer fit for recycling.
The current system still using lots of single-use plastic. I think if we can force to change their business system, we can reducing the number of the plastic leakage that become microplastic problems in the river, in the ocean, in the coastal, even in our air systems.
An Extended Producer Responsibility Law, or EPR law, makes producers responsible for the entire life cycle of their products. That includes design, production, use, and disposal. EPR is based on the polluter pays principle, where producers bear the costs associated with managing their products at the end of their life cycle.
Di mana setiap produsen itu punya tanggung jawab untuk mengurangi sampah yang berasal dari produk ataupun packagingnya. Tahun lalu saya ingat itu ada 20 produser yang sudah berjalan ya, full implementatif, dan kemudian mungkin sudah ada yang sudah mempersiapkan mungkin sampai di angka 500-an.
So the EPR Act in the Philippines requires companies to have a certain percentage of recovery of plastic waste that's equivalent to the plastics that they produce or use. Now, what they're doing with the plastics when they recover it is another story entirely, because we're seeing that a lot of plastics that are being recovered end up in cement kilns being co-processed and used as alternative fuels. And once you're burning it, that's the release of these toxic emissions for communities. There is no regulation that really prevents this kind of waste treatment that they're doing.
Scientists are exploring other ways to solve the plastic and microplastics problem. After all, even if we ban all plastic use today, tons of microplastic waste has already permeated our ecosystems. One possible solution is a reusable, biodegradable foam that can attract and trap almost 100% of 4 common types of microplastics. Another is peptides. Peptides are a type of amino acid that binds with polyethylene and polypropylene and breaks them down. So far, these solutions remain exploratory.
But is it actually feasible? Because if you're going to upscale it, you're talking about the entirety of the Philippines. Probably in small scale, these technologies will actually work. Putting them probably in our pitcher to collect the microplastics before you drink the water. But when we talk about the entire Philippines, we need to talk about more than 50% of our provinces are actually living on the coast. So how much of those technologies are scalable to that scale? So I think that's the challenge.
Jadi nanoplankton itu masuk plastik ya ukurannya tadi mungkin hampir sekitar seukuran sel lah, 10 mikron atau sekitar segitulah gitu ya. Itu jelas nggak bisa pakai mata, udah jelas lah nggak bisa gitu. Jadi intinya kita tidak bisa terhindar atau tidak bisa menghindari mikroplastik.
For now, microplastics are here to stay, and we're still finding out what the long-term impact will be on our health and our environment. But what is clear is the need to reduce plastic production, consumption, and waste that are fueling the microplastics crisis.
Bukan hanya plastik yang akan banyak tubuh kita, juga senyawa-senyawa yang tidak kita inginkan, yang berbahaya tentunya bagi tubuh kita, bagi metabolisme kita, yang bisa masuk ke tubuh kita semakin banyak gitu ya. Dan ini tentunya akan menghasilkan generasi-generasi berikutnya yang lemah gitu. Misalnya mudah sakit, anak-anak kita itu mungkin lebih tercemari lagi tuh. Kenapa gitu? Ya karena kita telah menurunkan kepada mereka mikroplastik ini gitu.
We always say nature will find a way, but it's just that we don't know how long would it take for nature to actually find its way. It might not be late for nature, but it might be late for us. When we talk about doing something now, it's not for us. It's actually for the future generation. And it's a responsibility that is lying on the shoulders of the current generation. So, do you want your sons, your kids to survive in the future? Do you want to give them a healthy planet to live in? Then that's a question that we need to answer right now.